I've been seeing a lot of people trying to push for the 44111 build, claiming that it is easier to farm, it is easier to obtain in the early game, and you should be doing it. No, you should never be doing it. That is completely wrong. And it's nothing to do with the fact that it's easier to obtain. It has nothing to do with the fact that the substats are easier to roll. It is just mathematically purely wrong. And it just comes down to simple calculus. It actually comes down to a pretty simple calculus problem called optimization, which I already talked about in a different video, but here's a little more detailed breakdown on a hopefully a simpler level instead. Now here's a simple graph that kind of explains the pictures. Now I want to make it very clear that this graph is not the final answers. Depending on the characters, depending on your build, your team, your graph could look different. But the general idea is always the same. Starting from the top yellow line, this is your 4-3-3-1-1 with a 5p set bonus. And as your substat get better, you can see your damage keep growing, and that just makes sense. And each one of these lines represent a different setup. Some of these are 4-4-1-1-1, some of these are 4-3-3-1-1 with like no set bonus. There will be a legend at the top of the screen right now. And you can see that without any substat, assuming you're only caring about main stats, you're still better off running a 4-3-3-1-1 build. Always. Why? Let's look into the math. The first assumption people make is that your 4-4-1-1 will have way better substat than your 4-3-3-1-1 because it is easier to farm. And that's completely false. That is because your 4-4-1-1-1 is transferable. This 4 here is equivalent to this 4. That means if you got a good forecast on your 4-4-1-1-1 setup, you have a good forecast for your 4-3-3-1-1 setup. These two pieces are the exact same. There's no different. The same go with the two 1-costs at the bottom. If your 1-cost have a god row for your 4-4-1-1 build, so will your 1-cost row for the 4-3-3-1-1 because they are the same, they're the share. So the only difference between these two sets are that you're running a 4-1 setup here versus a 3-3 setup here. And this is a massive difference since this gives 60% damage. Comparing these 4 pieces together, you'll see that the difference is that the 4-costs provide you with either 22% crit rate or 44% crit damage, plus the 1-cost that provide you with 18% attack. On the other hand, the two 3-costs each provide you with 30% damage, or I guess you could go 30% attack if you really want to. And a smart man at this point would immediately recognize that there's no way this will ever compete. The 30% damage main stat is just significantly better than the 4-1 main stat, to the point where even if you have the god row, the best row, the perfect row on your 4-1 piece, it probably won't compete with your 3-3 piece. But why? That is because crit is extremely expensive and extremely inefficient, and it gives very, very little damage. Let's look at why. Assuming your character don't have any stat right now, equipping it with a 30% damage boost just boosts your damage by 30%. That kind of makes sense. So if you're doing 100 damage per hit, giving it a 30% damage boost will bring it to 130. But what about critical strike? If you're running a crit damage main stat forecast, then you get 44% crit damage. But how much damage do you really get from that? Because it is not a 44% damage increase, I'll tell you that. Suppose you get a 44 crit damage increase. What does that really mean? Well, in Wording Wave, there's a base 150% critical damage modifier, but let's keep it simple and let's keep it 1-to-1 for now. So with a 44% crit damage increase, that means your crit is now going to do 144% damage of the base damage. So instead of doing 100 damage, when you do crit, you do 144 damage. But here's the problem. You don't crit every single time. You might crit half the time if you have 50% crit rate. You might crit 1/3 of the time if you have 30% crit rate. It depends on the critical rate modifier as well. That means you have to average out your true damage increase. So let's say you have a 50% crit rate and you crit half the time. So half the time you'll be doing 100 damage. Half the time you'll be doing 144 damage. Your average damage is going to be 100 plus 144 divided by 2, which is 122. And you can see that this 122 is less than 130. So the 30% damage increase is just straight up better than your 44% critical damage increase. But here's the worst part. This is assuming you already have crit rate. This is assuming you already have 50% crit damage, which if you go check your character right now, I don't even know if you have it. The reality is that crit is expensive to build. And what we mean by expensive is that in order to see an actual benefit from it, you have to get a lot of it. That is because critical rate doesn't function without critical damage, and critical damage doesn't function without critical rate. And even when it do function, in that previous example, I saw it with 50% critical rate, the damage increase is still not as good as the raw 30% damage increase from your elemental damage modifier. I mean, if you have a 100% critical rate, then yeah, your 44% crit damage increase is just a 44% damage increase, assuming you don't already have any critical damage modifier. But do you have a 100% critical rate? Can you even get a 100% critical rate in this game? And as your critical rate start dropping from 100 to like less and less and less and less, your critical damage is less and less and less and less effective. The simpler way to think about it is that crit is extremely overpriced, and for the most part, you have to pay double to get the same amount of damage. And again, that's because you have to build both crit rate and crit damage. So if you were to build a 4 cost crit rate and then a 4 cost crit damage, and you add the damage up together, it is not even as good as 1 free cost damage increase. Now that's not actually how it works, that's just a simple version. It depends on what other stat you have, which is the next part we're going to talk about. Despite all of this, why do you still want to build crit at the end? You can think about the idea of trying to maximize your damage as if you're trying to build a box as big as possible and the volume is your damage. So in this case, you're trying to build a box, there's 3 variables you can control: your width, your height, and your length. And each of these perfectly represent a different stat in the game, starting with attack percent, followed by damage percent, followed by crit. And each one of these variables increases the corresponding width, length, or height. And again, your goal is to make the box as big as possible. So how do you do it? The best way is to make them as even as possible. With simple mathematics, you can observe that if you were to build your box with a 5x5x5 dimension, then you'll have a volume of 125, because all you do is multiply the length, the width, and the height. But if you were to instead use 10 times 2 times 3, you notice that your volume is only 60. It's about half, even though in both cases the amount of material you use adds up to exactly 15. So here you use 10 plus 2 plus 3 length of material, which is 15. And on the other hand, you also use 5 plus 5 plus 5 material, which is 15. So in both cases, your total length adds up to 15. But the one where you evenly distribute them is significantly better. But here's the problem: the material is not priced the same. There's a price attached to them. Imagine you're a construction company and you have to pay for the individual length to maximize a box. Well, in order to increase the length of your attack, you have to pay $1 for each 1 meter. In order to increase the length of your damage, you have to pay $1 for each 1 meter. But for crit, you have to pay $2, maybe even $3 per meter. And why? Again, that is because crit is only effective when you build both critical rate and critical damage stat. Therefore, they upcharge you because it costs double the amount of material. That means the quickest way and the fastest way to maximize your damage is just ignore crit, because they are overcharging you. You just focus on attack and focus on getting damage. That's the quickest way of getting damage, until your damage and attack get so big to a point where it is no longer efficient to increase these stats. In mathematics, there's something called diminishing return, which means the more of the same thing you build, the less efficient it is. Now, it's not exactly diminishing return, but the term itself just makes it easier to understand. And what that means is that, let's suppose your attack is at 100, increasing this by another 50, bring it to 150, which is a 50% damage increase. However, bringing this another 50 up will bring it to 200, which is only a 25% increase from here. And you can see that even though in both cases you increase your length by 50, which means you pay $50, the amount of efficiency you actually get is not as high. You're getting half for the same price. And eventually, it is so inefficient that building crit, even though they're overcharging you, is more worth it than to continue to build your attack or your damage. Because at the end, when you have so much money, when you have like perfect stat everywhere, when you have perfect roll on each of your pieces, critical is worth it, because then at that point, your damage increase is a lot more significant from the crit, plus your damage increase from your other stat is not as significant. That's why you build crit at the very end, not the very beginning, because it is very expensive, but eventually it will be more expensive and less efficient to build other stat compared to building crit. Again, build crit at the end, not at the beginning. Do not build 44111. Stop building 44111. I know people are trying to do the 4-4-1-1-1 setup, especially on either Havoc or Thunder characters, because you can get the 5p set bonus, but it's all completely wrong. It has nothing to do with the set bonus. It has nothing to do with that it's easier to get crit because you can get both. It is simply inefficient in both of these cases compared to just doing a single free cost echo with the right main stats without either set bonus or without any sub stats. Unless you just don't have a single free cost echo of the corresponding element matching it, you should not be running 4-4-1-1-1. And keep in mind that again, there is the Elusive Realm event that gives you a free cost echo with a corresponding set on the corresponding element damage bonus. As always, this is a dumbed down version of the optimization problem in calculus that you'll find in high school, and you can go read a paper on it or a book on it if you're interested in learning more. But the general idea of the optimization problem is the same. In this video, you can see they're trying to build a 2-dimensional box, modifying their length and width to be as big as possible. And you just have to think about this as the exact same thing, but now you have 3 dimension instead, and it's corresponded to a stat in the game. But just to summarize it from the beginning, a 4-3-3-1-1 setup where your free cost simply has the right main stats, even though it is on the wrong set, even though it doesn't have substat or has terrible substat, it's pretty much always going to be better than any 4-4-1-1-1 setup you can possibly come to build. Your 4-4-1-1-1 setup can have the 5p set effect. Your 4-4-1-1-1 setup can have the best substat in the game. For the most part, it is not as good as simply running a 4-3-3-1-1 setup, as long as these 2 free costs have the right damage main stat. And that's all it takes. That's how different the map is. That's how overpowered the map is. And so once you start putting in the substat, 4-3-3-1-1 will win every single time. And if anyone asks why, that's because crit is expensive. You're paying $10 for 1 damage increase, or you could just be paying like $1 for 1 damage increase if you build damage stat instead. For critical, not only you have to build both stats, so it's at least twice as expensive, you don't even see any gain for the most part unless you hit a crit, then your critical damage modifier come into effect. So the actual gain itself, even when you have both stats, is not as high. I try not to make this video as simple as it is to understand for people without a mathematics background, but it's definitely kind of hard, especially when you're not familiar with the optimization problem. You know, without understanding like why you should be increasing the size of each length of the box evenly, it is very hard to explain like why you should be putting a stat this way. So I just hope I explained it as best as possible. But yeah, it has nothing to do with your substat. It has nothing to do with it being easier to be onset. The 4-3-1-1 setup is simply better regardless of everything. And that's the 2 most common mistakes that I see people are going around saying, oh, 4-1 is better because the substat is going to be better to roll, or it's easier to farm for onset. No, as long as your free cost has the right element damage on it. So I would appreciate if you guys can just like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly share the video to everyone who is kind of being misled by one of the most common mathematic error right there. And if I'm wrong, then I'm happy to be proven wrong, but someone would have to provide me with, you know, the same thing I did, basically a mathematic calculus sheet. And there are certain cases where 4-4-1-1 could be better, but it is extremely rare. It is extremely hard to achieve. For 99.5% of the cases, 4-3-3-1-1 should be better. So yeah, go happy hunting, Echoes, I guess. Subscribe, bye.